I'm Todd Goldman with Informatica, and I know it says on the program something about vibe. I'm actually I changed the topic a couple weeks ago. We just didn't get it in time for the program, but I'm going to talk about big data and Hadoop and how it's going to cross from experimentation into the mainstream. So if you're interested in that topic, please don't crowd yourself. There's plenty of space still in the room. Okay. So how many of you are familiar with this Geoffrey Moore picture? Raise your hand. So a few people. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar, let me explain it because it's kind of key to what I'm going to talk about. So in any market, when it starts out, so if you think about, let's say, the smartphone market years ago, I don't know, does anybody remember the Newton? Way back when? Probably very few people remember the Newton. It was the first, it was pre-smartphone. Yeah, you guys are a bunch of old farts back here, right? So, I'm losing my crowd by insulting them already. Just call me Don Rickles. So, any market starts off with people who want to try something new, and they don't care if it's difficult, they don't know if it's challenging, they don't care if it's challenging, they will try it anyway. And they're what Geoffrey Moore, who wrote this book, called the innovators or the techies. So they don't care about ease of use, they just want to be first. And then after they've tried it out, they're kind of influencers in the market. So they're the folks who maybe started with Hadoop at Facebook or actually at Yahoo. And what ends up happening is then you've got early adopters who say, hey, I've seen that these guys have proven that this thing can kind of work. It may not be exactly the way I would use it, but I can see how it might, maybe I can apply it. And they'll take that thing, even though it's not exactly been proven in the market, and they'll try it. So they're kind of the next wave. Then after that is the early majority. And these people, when they try a new technology, they will not try it because in theory it might work. They're going to try it because they saw somebody else who they know applied it to the same problem they applied it to, and they'll say, I'll buy that. And also, they're not going to pay as much as these innovators or the early adopters will. So the early adopters who paid $800 for an iPhone, right? Those people, they'll pay whatever. But then Apple lowered the price. They made it, obviously they had already made it really easy to use. And the early majority, they're pragmatists. They went and tried that. Same thing with technologies like Hadoop. The late majority, these people, they're gonna wait. They're gonna wait and see that they're not even fast followers. So the early majority might be fast followers in a market. The late majority are folks who are going to wait and see, yeah, I'm the low-cost provider in my industry, and I'm going to wait till most of my competitors have whatever that thing is, and then I'll try it. And the laggards, they're the Luddites. They get drawn into new technology kicking and screaming. So the risk for Hadoop, as it exists in the marketplace, like any new technology, is it could fall in the chasm. And I'm going to walk through what this chasm is all about. So there's a gap between this innovator and early adopters and the pragmatists. And Geoffrey Moore calls that the chasm. And technologies fall into the chasm because they don't make a transition from appealing to things that early adopters like, which is I can do the new thing, to things that the early majority likes. And the early majority likes things that are going to solve a business problem for me. So to the extent that Hadoop is great for the Facebooks of the world and the Yahoos of the world, that's fantastic. But for it to cross the chasm, it has to move from a level of difficulty in terms of, well, the opposite of ease of use. It's kind of a challenging environment to use. You have to be an expert. You have to be super knowledgeable to be successful with it. To how do you make it so people who aren't world experts are going to be successful? So if you don't do that, your technology will fall into the chasm. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind Geoffrey Moore. So how many people know what this is? What is it? It looks like a unicorn. It looks like it's actually a Hadoop data scientist. Very rare, very difficult to find. Some people might say imaginary. And this is exactly the point when it comes to this whole world of Hadoop and the whole issue of crossing the chasm. Right now, to use Hadoop, you got to go and find one of these guys or gals. And they're pretty rare. And I talk to a lot of customers, and the challenge they see with Hadoop is they cannot find people with the skill set to make them successful in deploying Hadoop. So they're out there looking for these data scientists, and while there might be enough data scientists out there for a large Wall Street bank to hire 20 or 30 of them to do some experimentation, even those guys are saying to people like me, we have a hard time hiring yet that many more because we can't afford to keep paying $300,000 to these folks. And also, those people aren't interested in solving some of the less interesting problems that we have to solve. They're not interested in the production aspects of whatever it is we're trying to do. So there's an issue that if we don't move from just building an environment, a Hadoop environment that the super skilled unicorn data scientists can solve, the Hadoop elephant could fall into that chasm. The other issue with Hadoop, how many of you are you doing Hadoop projects at all? A couple of you. How many of you are thought about doing Hadoop projects or heard about it? Okay, so a lot of people thinking about it. The other super secret issue that comes up a lot with Hadoop is, oh, we're going to do this fabulous project, but what people find out is that they end up spending not so much time just doing the analysis. Oh, we're going to do some cool analysis, we're going to pull this data together, and we're going to solve the problem for world hunger. You know, fantastic, but the number one issue is that 80% of the time that we see companies spend when they're trying to do a Hadoop project, they're actually spending it not on the analysis itself that everybody talks about. They spend it on getting the data in. They've got 5 different data sources they brought in, so they've got to get those things lined up. The data is dirty. So, oh, we pulled all the sensor data. Well, sensor data is notoriously noisy, so you got to clean that up. So they've got to clean that up. And then, once they've done all that, they're ready to do analysis. So you take this very expensive Hadoop data scientist, and you end up having them spend 80% of their time doing things that they don't actually really want to do. So yeah, this is another problem in this space. Another issue with what's going on in Hadoop is I love ice cream. Does there anybody who, I mean, I love ice cream. And when I go into the ice cream shop and I see the different flavors of ice cream, I sometimes have a hard time deciding which flavor of ice cream. Hadoop, buying from a Hadoop vendor today is like buying a different flavor of ice cream. It's all good, it's all delicious, but there are way too many of them. And this is an issue. The market can't support the 20, 30, however many distributions there are out there. And the last time I gave this talk was like 6 months ago, and like literally on the day, 2 more distributions appeared. So the issue right now is that when companies go to look for, well, which Hadoop vendor do I standardize on? Which one am I going to pick? The choice is very difficult. And am I making the right one? Are these guys going to be around in a few years? Because there are a lot of startups that are out there, and there are a lot of large companies that might be investing in it. But even then, are they going to be continuing to invest in the progression of Hadoop? So there's a bit of a market shakeout that I think is going to happen with regard to this. So which flavor of ice cream are you going to choose, and are you going to choose the right one? Tends to also be an issue. I see a lot of companies that I talk to have this problem. One other point: stone knives and bearskins. So I kind of talked about this already with regard to that Jeffrey Moore crossing the chasm curve. The tools that are available for Hadoop developers, and this is why it requires unicorns, the tools that are available for someone who isn't like a super duper big brain data scientist Hadoop developer, and those are the folks that are here today, they are not sufficient for your average Joe to do development. And the problem is that unless you get those average Joes doing development, you're going to find that this technology will go just like Corba or DCE. Are any of you familiar with Corba or DCE? Probably a few people. Okay, so one person in the back. So exactly. Very few of you even know what Corba and DCE are. And the reason you don't is because they were distributed computing environments. That's what DCE stands for. Corba was an object-oriented version of this. So kind of, they're not Hadoop, but they were distributed computing concepts. They were really hard to use, and they failed because the tools weren't available to make it possible for you to go out in the open market, hire a developer who is just an average guy, average gal, and have them work for you. So this is the other issue. The tools have to be made available so that people don't actually have to be a super duper Hadoop expert to solve specific problems. And I'll come back to some of those problems in a second. The other part of this, that you have to have tooling, you have to have the killer app. So what problem am I trying to solve? And I actually think some of these apps are starting to appear. So when we look at, when you think about the home computer or the PC, right, the killer app for that, first it was VisiCalc and then Excel. That became the first killer app for the home computer, not the home computer, but the personal computer. And then it became email, and then it became the internet. With Hadoop, I think we've yet to see those killer apps get developed. I think there's a lot of folks that are out in the hall back here trying to develop those apps. But from a corporate IT perspective, most of the companies that I'm talking to, and I jumped right in, I didn't really introduce myself. I'm Todd Goldman, I'm with Informatica, and we're a company, about $1 billion company, that focuses on software and tools for integrating data. You got to get data out of systems, you got to get data into systems, you got to master data, you've got to clean data. We're all about preparing the data for doing data warehouses or doing data integration, or I'm sorry, doing data warehouses or data analytics, or just moving large amounts of data. So that's what we do as a business. And when I look at Hadoop, people are saying, oh, we're gonna jump in this Hadoop thing. They don't always know what they're gonna do, and they're looking for the killer app. And so some of those killer apps, companies are gonna build themselves, and they're gonna build new businesses on them. Other killer apps will start getting developed, and you'll start seeing come to market. But unless we have those killer apps, it's still gonna stay in the experimentation phase. Another big issue that I see is it goes beyond the killer app, and this is really incredibly common. Go talk to a company and they say, we're going to do Hadoop. What are you going to do? I got like 10 ideas. Well, which one of the 10? I don't know. So this is, the world is their oyster, and the challenge is that unless you have some direction that you're heading in, this is just another technology that's going to sit on the shelf. And we see this a lot. There's an awful lot of Hadoop shelfware right now, because people haven't really thought through what problem am I actually going to solve with this thing. And you need to work backwards from a problem that I'd like to solve this problem, but I don't have enough, can't get enough data, or I can't process enough data to solve that problem. Now, the minute you can figure that out, you can do some interesting things. There are a lot of interesting companies that are out there that are using Hadoop to solve interesting problems, but they work backwards from the problem and realize Hadoop was the tool, as opposed to the other way around. Right? It's a hammer looking for a nail. So kind of going back to that stone knives and bearskins analogy. Another big issue that's going to keep Hadoop from crossing the chasm is security. And this is we've been talking a lot about security in the last couple of months. Edward Snowden kind of disappeared from the mainstream of discussion in the news, but the point is that Hadoop doesn't have any security. So until that problem's solved, there are lots of companies that look at it and go, ooh, really interesting stuff, but until there's a security layer there, I'm not so sure that I'm all that interested in this. So one of the other issues is not only who can access the data that's in Hadoop and how secure that environment is, but it's also what happens when I combine data from source A to data in source B, and as part of that combination, now violate your privacy. So there was a gentleman who I saw this morning who was talking about he has a deal with the IRS, and he has IRS data that he's aggregating and pulling together and offering services on it. Well, he has to secure that data, but he also has to de-identify it, and the only way he's allowed to offer services on that data is by aggregating always 10 or more individual tax return or IRS pieces of information, tax return information. He has to aggregate at least 10 individual people or 10 companies before he can release that information as a service that he's offering based on kind of a new kind of analytics capabilities. The same thing was true with Obama in the election. So how President Obama ended up winning the election, or one of the many things, when it came down to data analytics, the Obama campaign was really worried that they were going to get outspent. Especially in states like Ohio. So they thought, well, we've got to target our ads better than anybody else. So they went out and they had this Facebook app where they could go and gather information about you, and you could recommend friends who might be interested. So they go, okay, we know people who are potentially Obama supporters, but they're not convinced they're going to vote for Obama, but they're potential supporters because they raised their hand in Facebook. Now what we don't know is how to reach them. So they went out, and it turns out that there was a company that had set-top box information. And they had set-top box information about individual people. Well, in the Facebook app, they had the right to know who you were, and you gave up your rights with that Facebook app that described who you were and your potential interest in him. But when you signed up for that set-top box, you didn't agree to let those guys resell your information. So one of the issues that you have with something like Hadoop is that you have the ability to combine all kinds of information that any one piece might be okay. So information about what you watch might be okay, but combining that with who you politically might be aligned with, not so good. So the way they solved that problem was they anonymized the set-top box information, and then they looked at it in aggregate. And I'm going to come back to some of the things that they did that were really interesting in their use of big data. But the thing that could have gotten them into hot water was, if I'm not careful how I combine these different sources of data, I create a privacy and security problem. So other things that are kind of slowing down the adoption of big data. Now, that said, I actually believe that we will cross the chasm. That we're not going to, that the Hadoop elephant isn't going to fall into the chasm and die off. And the reason for that is multifold. First of all, necessity is the motherhood of invention. You know, so back to this story about President Obama and their need to have more targeted ads. So they had a problem, and their problem, at least in their minds, they had a problem, which was, we don't have enough money to outspend the Romney campaign, so we have to have more targeted ads. Well, the Romney campaign didn't have this problem, right? They thought they had plenty of cash. So what they thought they would do, is they would go into Ohio and they would buy ads, and they would just plaster ads everywhere, and they'd buy up all the expensive airtime. And the Obama campaign knew they could not outspend them, so they said, okay, we'll take this data that I just talked about from the set-top boxes, which they had to anonymize. We'll take this data that we had from our Facebook app, we'll combine it together, and we'll figure out who might be likely to vote for us. Now, we don't care if we know you're going to vote for us, and we don't care if we know you're not going to vote for us, because we're not trying to sway those people. We're just trying to find the people who, by filling out this little Facebook app, look like they were kind of in between. But how do we find them? Well, by combining those two sets of data, what they were able to do was figure out very precisely how to target ads. And so these are some of the places they targeted at them. They targeted 1 a.m. repeats of The Insider. Like, who the heck would have thought to run an ad at 1 a.m. in the morning on The Inside? I don't even know what this show is. Does anyone know what this show is? I have no idea what this show is. Or afternoon showings of Judge Joe Brown. Now, it turns out the reason for the 1 a.m. repeats of The Insider, kind of working backwards from what the data told them, was that they found that there were a lot of swing shift voters, people who worked swing shift in a factory, who would then come home and they would have their dinner late at night and watch these shows. So they'd watch 1 a.m. repeats, they did afternoon showings of Judge Joe Brown. I think he's like a Judge Judy type show. I've never heard of him either. They ended up spending 35% less per ad on ads than the Romney campaign. They ended up spending $90 million less, so they spent 35% less per ad, $90 million less, and they got 40,000 more impressions. And they ended up winning Ohio. So they used data to their advantage, but because they thought they had to. And the reason that is important is because when you go into a big data project and you are flush with cash and you just pour a ton of money into it, you'll think that you've got plenty of time and plenty of resources. And how many of you have done a startup? I mean, we're in the Bay Area, so a lot of people, if you've ever done a startup, right, the thing that helps a startup in a lot of ways, because I've done several myself, and necessity is the motherhood of invention. You find clever ways to do new things because you are cash-strapped. And one of the things that I found with a lot of the companies that we've talked to is that their world is unlimited because they've got plenty of cash and plenty of time, and this is true more in the corporate world. They have plenty of cash and plenty of time, and as a result, they're not focused on the problem they want to solve. So I guarantee you their big data project is going to fail. In fact, 40% of big data projects fail today, whereas 25% of your average IT projects fail. And a lot of that's because tools are too hard, lack of focus, too much resource, too much money, and not enough pressure. I actually believe pressure is a good thing. Okay, so what is it that's going to get us out of this chasm? First thing, automation. So instead of people doing Hadoop development in Pig, how many of you know, does anybody know Pig and Hive in this room? A couple of people, right. So instead of having to know pig and hive, and next is going to be yarn, and who knows what else is going to be after that, instead of having to know that to do your Hadoop development, what I expect to see happen in the market is there's a ton of investment going in closing the skills gap by automating. You can't, this is an F-14 fighter. It's super automated plane, incredible piece of technology, giant flying wing. You have to be reasonably skilled to fly it, right? You can't, not just your average Joe can fly it. But there's a lot of stuff that it just does automatically for the pilot. And that skill gap has got to get closed for Hadoop, once again, for it to be successful. We're going to see an evolution in tools at a variety of layers. From the layer of today, we see companies that are doing data integration and data quality and cleaning up their data. They're hand coding pig. And then when they actually do their analysis, they're hand coding pig and they're hand coding in HQL. We expect to see that gap get closed by companies like, Informatica, Tableau, Datamir, I'm blanking on a few others, but there are a number of companies that are out there investing at different layers of the stack. We're investing at the integration layer to help to make it easy so that you don't have to be a super duper Hadoop developer there. But the same thing's true of how do you enable a business user, let's say, to go in and do a query that's going to magically take care of things for them on Hadoop. That's what's going to close that gap. Because when the business users are able to actually use this technology and not know that it's happening underneath the covers, that's when you're just going to start seeing this go from the early adopter to the early majority user. So the way this, I'm just going to give you a little bit about Informatica's point of view. I already talked earlier about this 80%. 80% of the effort today in Hadoop project is spent doing data integration, not data analysis. And we've seen this, I've had people debate this with me, but this is empirically true. We've seen it happen over and over and over again at our customers where the problem that they have, and by the way, this is even true at your favorite consumer online service where they're known for using Hadoop. What's happened with them is that they have so much data coming in and they're hand coding everything. They spend all their time on integration. And the issue, even with places like Facebook and Yahoo and Google, is the people who have to do this hand coding for the data integration work, it's not cool. They don't want to do that. And guess what? The code breaks. And they've got to go fix that code. So they end up spending more of their time on the integration stuff once again. So you've got to change the equation. And I don't want to spend too much time on the ad part of this. I just want conceptually you guys to walk away with what it is that we're trying to do at Informatica, and I think we're going to see the industry do, is provide automation that switches that equation. Make it so that an average data integration developer who doesn't know Hadoop at all, can do data integration work. You're going to see the same thing. An average data analyst who doesn't know Hadoop at all is going to have to be able to do data analysis on Hadoop. And there'll still be a place for data scientists, but it's not going to be, but they're going to focus on the more difficult and more challenging problems. So the way that we think about this and the way we're trying to solve this problem is the other point that I want to make about this is that Hadoop is not a technology that's going to stand alone. I know that there was a couple articles about 6 months ago, the CIO of Sears, who is no longer there, by the way, he was claiming, we've moved everything off of our other systems. We've moved it all into Hadoop. Bunch of crap. Never happened. He's still using mainframes. He's still using SQL Server. He's still using MySQL. He's still using all this other stuff. And the reality is that there isn't going to be a world that is just Hadoop. And there isn't going to be a world that's just ETL. And there isn't going to be a world that's just MySQL or NoSQL. The old stuff never goes away. And so the way we're trying to solve this problem, and the way we think that people should think about it is, so if I'm going to integrate across the cloud and across servers and data federation, we see the way that we see the world as you want to have a kind of a common development environment that's separated from the actual underlying technology. So we've come up with a concept that we call a virtual data machine. And the idea of that is that if you look at Informatica, we started off as an ETL, extract, transform, and load, batch movement data company. And there was a graphical interface, and there was an engine. And then we ended up porting that engine into the cloud. So now we have cloud-based services that do data integration. And then we did data federation using the same engine. And then we embedded that into new applications. And then we took that same engine and we ported it onto Hadoop. And what that means for our customers, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because it means that people who are using our old technology, the old Informatica, 20 years old is now old. This company's not that old, but that old technology, those people who learn how to develop those skills to do data integration on what's called Power Center, the Informatica product, they also are now Hadoop developers. And I expect that that's what's going to happen in a number of other areas. You're going to see companies like, you're going to see Microsoft take Excel, and it's got data in it. Well, what if you could do some simple Excel-based stuff, but underneath it you had Hadoop? The same kind of thing. Expect to see people separate the visualization of the task they've got to do, and then separate that from the actual running of it. So when you don't have big data, you don't need Hadoop. You can just use what we call Vibe. You could use a Vibe engine. You could use that ETL engine standalone. But if you do have big data, you inject that into Hadoop and it scales. And the reason why that's important is going back to back to the unicorn, is that skills leverage is critical in this space. Because Hadoop isn't going to solve every problem, nor is federation, nor is ETL, nor is real-time, because the mainframe never goes away. And the thing that came after the mainframe never goes away. And the thing that came after that never goes away. And by the way, Hadoop will get surpassed by something else, and Hadoop will never go away. So all these technologies underlying everything never go away. So the key to crossing that chasm is, as an industry, what I expect to see happen is us hiding that underlying complexity and providing a common graphical kind of environment to make it easier to complete projects. The other thing that's going to happen is when you think about, if you're thinking about embarking on a Hadoop project, don't go up into the upper right-hand corner right away when you start. The companies that we see that are successful in tackling Hadoop kinds of projects are doing things like, oh, I have my data warehouse. And today I've got a bunch of data in the data warehouse. And my data warehouse, I'm spending a lot of money on this data warehouse appliance from one of the data warehouse vendors. And instead of me just spending more on them because I've got more data, I can actually take some of that data off that expensive data warehouse and I can move it into Hadoop. And I can pre-process it in Hadoop and then move the output of that into the data warehouse. Not a very complicated project. I'm just doing what I did before, but using cheaper off-the-shelf hardware and cheap and free technology to pre-process some of that additional data. And move, instead of spending another $30 million on Teradata or Exadata or one of those proprietary data warehouses, I'm now using a combination of that with Hadoop. So I'm not reinventing the world. Then get comfortable with the technology. And then say, okay, now that I'm comfortable with this in a simple way that saved me money, right? Saved me a ton of money because a Hadoop cluster is like 1/100th the cost of a proprietary data warehouse, much, much cheaper. So if I don't make a big leap to try to cure cancer, but I just solve a cost problem, now I've gotten comfortable with using the technology. Now I can maybe, okay, let's add new kind of data into my warehouse. Let's add social media data, and I'll parse that data, and I'll analyze it first in Hadoop, and then once again put the output into my warehouse. The same kind of thing. Progress along, you get more comfortable, and then move to the next project. But be focused about those projects and move up that value and complexity curve in the projects that you're trying to engage in. The last thing is time, right? Some of this is just going to take time. We're early in the process. Hadoop is still pretty new. I mean, typically new technologies take about 7 years before they really start getting to that adoption. And Hadoop is, I don't know, we're about 4, might be a little bit longer into it, but where it's kind of hit the market the last 3 to 4 years. So we're pretty early into this process. So there's plenty of time for this to get going. And there'll also be time for the tools to develop so that you don't have to go and necessarily hire those big data Hadoop guys. So one way to get started, if you're interested, Informatica has a free product, free data integration product. It's a classic ETL product, but it uses the same interface that the Hadoop product, that our product that runs on Hadoop uses. So if you can use this, if you can do data integration with this, you can actually do data integration on Hadoop. So just search Power Center Express on Google and try it out if you want. So just in closing, to cross the chasm, a couple of things have to happen. There's got to be an automation of the automation and a gap closing of the complexity that exists in the Hadoop environment, in the Hadoop ecosystem. And the Hadoop vendors are investing in that with technologies that make it easier to deploy a cluster. Companies like Informatica are investing in that in technologies that make the data integration portion of the project easier. Companies are investing in making the visualization of the data easier. Companies like Yazdi, if you haven't heard of them, another interesting company that's trying to make it a lot easier to do analysis on Hadoop. Second point, start small and think big. Don't try to necessarily tackle the whole world. I mean, this is like a classic IT issue where it never fails. A new technology comes along and IT organizations go, yep, we're going to jump in full force and we're going to do the biggest, most amazing thing. There's a learning cycle to all of this. And the last point is focus. Have a problem that you actually need to solve. Don't think that you're just going to go and play with it, because if you play in the sandbox in today's IT world, the money, and if you're trying to sell to guys and they're just playing in a sandbox, that money will dry up. There has to be a real problem that either you or your customer or your internal customer, depending on who you are, they've got to solve, or else the big data experiment that you're running off on is going to fall into that chasm. So with that, I'm Todd Goldman, and if you've got questions, I'll go ahead and take any. No questions? Fantastic. Well, thanks. Have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.